Hello all, welcome to our third lecture this week, Distinct Colonial Populations. In this lecture I'm going to be talking about all the populations I haven't talked about before. I'm sure you're going to notice that most of the previous two lectures were on white settlers, mostly from Britain. So this is going to be about the ignored and excluded populations. The Europeans who settled the colonies developed systems to respond to the needy, but only among their own populations. These accommodations did not include any provisions for African slaves or for Native Americans. Neither group was considered in the consideration of providing assistance to the indigenous or to being subject to establishing social order. So more than just not including them in assistance for the poor, they weren't actually considered a part of the social order itself. The Native Americans were usually pushed aside. I'm sure that many of you remember from your American history class that, the population of Native Americans was larger before European settlers got here, and that was because they brought diseases with them that Native Americans did not have immunity to, and these diseases actually spread in epidemics across the country, and because there's very little written record, we can't even be 100% sure how many lives were lost. And then, of course, as the English settled, they attacked Native Americans and pushed them west. The Africans, many of who began as indentured servants but became slaves, become the workforce of the new, especially Southern American economic system. Both groups were, as I said, not viewed so much as a part of the social order or the society, but as needing of social control and not benefiting from community assistance. The description of early social welfare describes New England and the middle colonies. As I mentioned in a previous lecture, we talk about American colonies, but really what we're talking about is New England and the middle colonies. The southern colonies, their community structure, religious traditions, and population were very different. They were not as dense, and they were less likely to use the English poor law. The southern colonies were spread among plantations, with maybe only one large city, Charleston. So the governing system and the religious traditions were different from the northern colonies. Initially, they began as the land was awarded to English gentry, who were considered the priders. So they really become like little kingdoms. Plantations do, and there's really very little influence from other plantations or larger communities. Responsibility for slaves rested with the family who owned the slaves, and not with the community at all. There was no community outreach if slaves were mistreated by their owners. As I mentioned earlier, owners were not punished if they mistreated or killed slaves. Eventually, there are even laws that developed that give more power and authority to slave owners. And this failed to establish a communal response to any kind of impoverishment found in the slave communities or slave families. And it begins a premise that African Americans do not deserve community assistance, and it really is the start of that idea. Another population that we haven't really talked about is the mentally ill / mentally handicapped. And there's really very little known about the mind at this time period. They're not necessarily really in tune with these ideas that have developed about the mentally ill, and those who are mentally handicapped or developmentally delayed. They were made in their own homes. They were supported mostly by their family or sometimes a greater family community outreach. The mentally ill who disrupted family relations were usually viewed more as an economic and a social problem than as a medical one. Much like other groups we're discussing, it was much more about control than becoming a part of the social hierarchy, social order. Some effort was made to deal with individuals described as dangerous to others, but we have few records about what exactly kind of care they provided for them. And then veterans, which were recognized, unlike the other previous groups, as distinctly deserving of aid. Some colonies provided some support to men who were injured in the support of colonies, in particular even before we have a larger federal government, we have these local governments who would do battle with Native Americans or other dangers they saw to themselves. And these militias might, especially if they were injured in battle, receive some sort of aid or support. From the time of the American Revolution, veterans have been identified as deserving of assistance, particularly if they're disabled in combat. George Washington acknowledged that if veterans were not guaranteed some kind of assistance after defending their country, no one would want to serve. And I mean, I think that idea is pretty obvious. Another thing that did not apply to veterans is the residency requirements. With Elizabethan poor law, the idea was communities did not want to take care of any poor that were not their own. So there were often residency required. So you had to be a part of the community. You had to live here. You couldn't just move into a community and expect some kind of support. You had to prove that you lived there. And if not, you were a vagabond, and those were treated very differently. But with veterans, that's different. They're never viewed as vagabonds. And while no longer serving, even after, hence the concept of veterans, they had earned privileges was the idea, and keeping in notion with that, if they were poor or disabled or whatever, they were kept as a part of the worthy or deserving poor. Some forms of assistance they received was assistance, as I mentioned, to disabled veterans, particularly disabled in battle, pensions for the elderly, and this is way before any ideas of Social Security, which won't come about till the 20th century. And then lastly, there's various forms of relief for widows and orphans whose breadwinner, their provider, had been lost in battle. This is one of the first forms of government assistance. Initially, they were wards of the colony rather than local communities like other indigenous people. So it's a little more government support than community support. Eventually, federal government offers aid in 1818. Now, keep in mind that is nearly 40 years after the American Revolution, so this is not necessarily a quick idea, but Congress enacted the Revolutionary Pension Act, which combined features of a pension plan with poor law principles. So that's my discussion about some of the other groups that we haven't yet discussed this week. As always, these are my references, and just one other thing, be sure that you check them out. They might be able to help you with your topic if you think you might be interested in talking about some of these other groups. Thanks, guys. Have a great week.